Good morning. This is Tracy Hales Vass, right on Four Corners. Today, I'm talking with J. Allen Whitt about his novel Notes from the Other Side of the Mountain. Love Confronts the Wounds of War. Finalist for the New Mexico-Arizona Book Awards. Good morning, Dr. Whitt. Well, I really enjoyed your book, Notes from the Other Side of the Mountain, and I liked the characters were great, and the setting actually was almost another character.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that because that was my intention. I think anytime you set something in New Mexico, you almost have to treat the environment as a character.
Absolutely. So give our listeners a little synopsis of the book.
Well, the book is written in first person, based very loosely on my own experiences in life. It's set in New Mexico in a small town. It's a story, a love story, and also a story about the effects of war. That's the reason the subtitle, Love Confronts the Wounds of War. The story starts in high school days. The character, Gary, who is a leading male character, meets Christy. A new girl has shown up in town. He's infatuated with her. To make a long story short, they establish a relationship. Then Gary is threatened with a draft and is taken to Vietnam, where he is aboard an aircraft carrier off the coast of Vietnam, and has all kinds of adventures and misadventures there. Suffers some trauma from those experiences, what we would today call PTSD. He returns to his hometown in hopes of rekindling a relationship with Christy. They'd had a falling out earlier before he went to the Navy. And from there, it develops into a relationship that has trials and tribulations, as all of our lives do.
Wounds of war occur on all different levels.
Right. Here, we're talking primarily about psychic wounds.
That's right.
PTSD, which, as you know, is a very big problem today.
Yes.
A lot of veterans from all the wars we've fought recently, including Vietnam, World War II, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And the more recent wars. We seem to have wars going on all the time.
Yes.
So mainly I meant the psychic wounds, the psychic burden of experiences that people suffer. And I've worked with veterans out here at the VA hospital, a member of a writing group. And a lot of veterans in the group have PTSD. And there's some theory that PTSD actually changes the brain in ways that makes it very, very difficult to get rid of those memories. And they can persist a lifetime, as they often do for veterans, and can be triggered by a lot of different things, car backfiring, door slamming, that sort of thing. So it's a very difficult issue.
Give our listeners a little feel for the book by reading a little bit, would you?
I will do that. Let me preface this
please.
by saying that I have two brief passages I thought I might read. One has to do with an accident that happened aboard the Navy ship. It's quite graphic, but it explains some of the experiences that the character Gary went through.
Great.
The other passage is basically about the relationship between Christy and Gary, and shows their love beginning to develop. So I think I'll start with the more chilling one, which is focused on an accident that happened on the aircraft carrier. A rocket exploded below decks, caused a lot of chaos. Chaos was unfolding around us, men yelling and running up and down the passageway. The ship's loudspeakers blared, General quarters, all hands, man your battle stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The kid's eyes rolled upward, and the chief and I stared at him as he slumped back against the bulkhead. The chief looked over at me. Can you stay with him, sir? I nodded. He said, I'm going to help out, and ran into the smoke toward the mess deck. Another rolling cloud of heavy smoke belched past me and obscured my vision. I felt searing heat on my face and quickly ducked down by the sailor. He grabbed my arm. His hand was hot like a baked potato with a mushy, sticky feel. I'm not allowed to die. I can't die, can I? Oh, I can't stand it. Help is coming. Take care of you. It'll be okay. I knew that what I'm telling him might have a lie, a necessary lie. I needed to stay as calm as possible and reassure him. Please don't leave. Oh, I won't. I'll be here. He looked up at me and said in a strangely quiet voice, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. I can pray on it. He moaned, arched his head back, and writhed in agony. His eyes moved randomly. His eyelids were swollen. I wasn't sure he could see. I said, just a little while now, pal. Help is on the way. Oh, you pray. Can you pray to the angels with me, Father? Yes, I can. I will. I tried to think of a prayer. Just then someone, a medical corpsman, leaned down by me and said, I'll take over, sir. He took a quick look at the kid and then motioned to someone behind me. Two corpsmen with a stretcher carefully lifted the sailor onto it. He raised his head, looked back at me from the stretcher, and cried out, oh, move him out of the way, please, can you? I asked, move what? Those devils over there, Father, please. Yes, I see them. Don't worry, I'll keep them away. Then, just as if he were thanking a neighbor for the loan of a pair of hedge clippers, he said, I appreciate it, and slowly shut his eyes. His arm flapped down over the edge of the stretcher. The corpsman disappeared around the corner with him. So that was an attempt to capture difficulty of being in war, and it stands for a lot of other kinds of physical and psychic injuries that people suffer.
One thing I found interesting about that passage is it made me realize again that our injuries of war don't just happen on the battlefield, like on the ship. That wasn't from a bombing or anything, was it?
No, it was exploding air-to-air missile called a Zuni, which I explain in another passage. But aircraft carriers have been described as floating bombs.
Wow. Because
they have thousands of gallons of fuel oil, aviation gasoline, ammunition, bombs. A lot of things can go wrong, and they have been known to seriously go wrong.
Yes.
Today, with the new aircraft carriers, we have different problems, but still you have some hazardous situations aboard aircraft carriers that, unfortunately, there's very little that can be done about them given the nature of the job.
And you were personally on an aircraft carrier for some time, correct?
Yes, I was, and I was served 2.5 years, and the accident that I describe is in the book is based on an actual accident that happened aboard ship, but it attempts to show the reality of living on a ship where you're confined and face all these dangers. And of course, PTSD, I should say, PTSD does not just happen in war. It can happen to people outside of the context of war.
Right.
Any kind of very traumatic event can trigger those kinds of changes in the brain, and they are very hard to get rid of and to deal with often. Probably one reason that so many veterans today, unfortunately, are committing suicide.
Yeah, you touch on that in the book.
I also had a psychologist whose specialty was PTSD read the book, and he thought it was a very excellent description of the kinds of things that happen that cause PTSD. And in other places in the book, you see the results of that in the characters. Yeah,
it affects most of your characters, especially the two main characters.
Christy, of course, suffers in a different way.
Yes.
But she has definitely some problems, connected not only with, I won't reveal the plot, but it's connected not only with her personal life, but her experience of people she's connected with.
It affects her on multiple levels also.
Right.
Yes.
Affects everybody around people who have PTSD, really.
Both your characters in this are very real characters. I felt like I got to know them quite well. You wrote them very well and very realistically.
Well, thank you. I think one of the things that you experience sometimes, if you're lucky as a writer, is the characters start feeling real to you as the writer. And they do. I mean, I still feel that I can visualize the characters and have a sense of how they might react in different situations.
I'm
So that's
sure.
something a writer always likes to hear, because the characters should be realistic and the dialogue should be realistic.
And neither one of the two main characters were all good, all bad. They each had their foibles and their issues, and that made
That's
them.
right. I don't try to present them as archetypes for some, kind of situation, but I tried to show that they're real and they have real problems as well as strengths and weaknesses, as we all do.
Do you have another passage to read then?
Yeah, this is the one about the two characters, Gary and Christy. It was unusually warm for a Sunday in April. I bought some cheese and apple juice and picked Christy up at her house. We drove up the valley and then hiked up to a meadow I knew about. The view from there allowed us to see out to where everything faded into deep blue. "Oh, this is something," she said. "You just know about all these good places." We lay back on the blanket and I looked into her eyes. "Something's bothering me." Her smile faded. "What is it?" I said, "Hold still a minute." As I studied her eyes, I raised my hand to shield them from the sun. After a moment, I removed my hand and then returned it to shade her eyes once more. She asked, "What are you doing? Is something wrong?" "No, I just needed to make sure." "Gary, what are you talking about? Stop teasing. It's impossible to know just where your eyes end and the sky starts." The concern on her face became a smile. Then, in an act of pretended indifference, she raised her head to toss back her hair. "Ha, I bet you've heard that in a movie or something." I said, "Nope, I wouldn't kid you. I was thinking about it when we drove up here, and I've decided it's true, pretty much." She tried to slap my hand but missed. I put my arm around her and pulled her to me. She squealed and pretended to resist. Then she leaned over against me and looked up and said, "I knew you were going to end up making a joke." "It's not a joke." I bent down and we kissed for a long time. Warmth flooded into my face. I knew that my ears were glowing as usual. Afterwards, Christy nestled her head against me. There was a scent of flowers in her hair, and I felt her breath on my neck. We said nothing for a few moments. Soon I began to feel awkward. What do I do now? I wanted to break the silence. I smiled and said, "Well, I guess that's what the movies say is supposed to happen." She returned the smile and put her arm around my waist and tried to tickle me. I grabbed her hand. "You're so bad." Christy was in the glory of her late teens. I was beginning to understand that I loved her. The world was sweet. I did not yet realize that her captivating looks and playful spirit concealed a deep reservoir of inner turmoil.
Very good.
So those were attempts, to give a sense of what the book's about. It's a little hard to summarize because it's about some pretty terrible things that happen in the world and some pretty wonderful things
Wonderful
that happen.
things, which is real life. Yes.
Yeah. We all know that. I think we all have our trials and tribulations.
I was just going to say you had a long career, and then did you start writing after you retired, or had you been writing all along?
Well, I was an academic, a sociologist for almost 40 years, and of course, as a researcher and academic and teacher, I did a lot of writing.
Right.
Academic writing, I won some awards for that. But I've always had an interest in storytelling. My grandmother had a big influence on me. She grew up in the Ozarks and was a great storyteller. So the kids would all be fascinated listening to her stories, and I guess that had a lot of influence over me. And so before I retired, back 2007, I started doing a little writing, primarily short memoir about experiences I've had and travels I've gone on. And decided, I think I'll actually send it in to Southwest Writers here in New Mexico,
right,
and get it critiqued. A couple of pieces I sent in and got some encouragement that, they thought they were good. And I sent another piece in then, and the review came back and encouraged me to think about writing a novel. And I had never thought about that in my wildest dreams. But I decided, I'll give it a shot. And I was surprised that I really got into it. Like 6 or 8 hours a day, I would sit there to my wife's displeasure sometimes. Mm-hmm. But it was almost like meditation.
Right.
because you really have to focus on what you're doing, and you shut the world out, ideally. Yes, it became a great pleasure for me, and I think writing it, creating these characters, engaging in creative activities is always very rewarding. And I think I learned a lot about myself by writing it, even though it's not really explicitly about me.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly have to draw on some of my own predilections and experiences in presenting these characters. And you do learn a lot about yourself. I recommend it for anyone who is thinking about something to do after retirement or even during their working years. I'm a member of a writing group here in Albuquerque, and we meet every 2 weeks. And we've been doing that for about 3 years now, and it's been very rewarding. And we help each other.
That's right.
And I have, written some other things that have been fortunate to get some awards and recognitions and so forth.
Well, that's great. The Southwest Writers, a lot of authors that I interview are part of the Southwest Writers, and they seem to be a group that gives a lot of help, critiquing and encouragement, and provides a lot of support.
Yes, they do, and they offer classes and workshops, and I've taken some of those.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have quite a few members here in New Mexico. You know, you've got a lot of authors that live here.
Yes.
And many of them are members of Southwest Writers. And
Right.
as you say, Southwest Writers is a great resource because you get to know other people and you can bounce ideas off of them and find writing groups to get involved in. And that's a great way to do it because you get feedback, and you need feedback.
You do need feedback.
As a writer.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You get so immersed in what you're writing, sometimes you become semi-blind
That's true.
to what another person is going to see or not see in the work. So every writer needs an editor.
Right.
No matter what their level of development, they all, have people they rely on to give them feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all very constructive and positive and just a great experience.
So in this Notes from the Other Side of the Mountain, had this story been knocking around in your brain for a while before you attempted the novel?
I had written a very short piece, sort of a memoir, a reflection on my time in New Mexico, which I very much enjoyed. It had some experiences that I always treasure, as well as some that were unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
But I had written a little passage about that, and it got some very good feedback. I was amazed. I actually happened online to an editor who had worked for Macmillan, and he thought the piece I wrote was nearly perfect. So I thought, holy moly.
Well, there you go.
maybe I ought to do more of this.
Yes.
And that's what got me thinking, really, about making this kind of a second career.
That's great.
And I've spent a lot of time doing it, and as I say, very much enjoy it.
Well, what are you working on now?
I am, at the moment, I've written a little bit of everything. I write memoirs. I've done a lot of traveling. I've been to about 30 different countries.
Oh.
I write some memoirs about my experiences visiting the mountain gorillas in Rwanda, so forth and so on, traveling through Europe. And so I write a memoir, and I also write various levels of poetry, which I loved as a kid. I read a big anthology of the classical poets and was very stricken by it.
Mm.
And I've always had an interest in poetry, and I've done some writing lately in that vein, which is receiving a fair amount of appreciation. So I like that. I recently, having my military background and working with the writers out at the VA hospital here, I have also visited some of my memories and been writing stories and memoirs about that. And I just completed one short piece, about a page and a half, which I entered in a contest that's sponsored by the Veterans Administration all over the country. And it was selected for a first prize in the national competition. And so in October, they're going to fly me out to Des Moines, Iowa, and I'm going to read my piece on a stage presentation. So I've won several awards there, and that's been gratifying.
Oh, yes.
So I've done a little bit of everything,
Sounds like it. Now, you said that you lead a writer's workshop with the Veterans Hospital.
Yeah.
How's that?
It's considered recreational therapy
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of vets, because many of them in the group, not me, but many in the group suffer from PTSD. And writing can really help them to face some of those issues. And the way it typically works is they will start writing around the issue
Oh.
rather than really about the issue directly.
Mm-hmm.
And then gradually, as they get more comfortable and they get used to the experience of writing their experiences, they can perhaps get to talk about some of the things that really triggered the PTSD. One of the members of the group was an Army sniper, Afghanistan, which it left him with a lot of trauma because his mission was to kill people and to kill from a distance surreptitiously. And he had some experiences that were terrifying, including one time he was given a target that he was to watch for that turned out apparently to be a fairly young girl.
Oh, my.
And he called back into headquarters and said, "Hey, this can't be right." And they said, "Take the shot."
Wow.
So he did. And, he, as a result, he has tremendous PTSD. And those are the kinds of things that people there deal with. A lot of them were directly in combat. I was not.
Mm-hmm.
But, I certainly saw the effects of combat from a distance.
So,
And they deal with it through writing and various other ways like fishing and sports. But one of them is one of the recreation therapies is writing, and there's rotating members of the group. I suppose altogether maybe there are 20.
mm-hmm.
And on any given time, they meet every week. You may have 6 or 8 that show up and share their experiences and read their writing and get feedback on it. I wanted to mention that one of the other things I've done that has allowed me to write about situations that I haven't been directly involved in is the Veterans History Project. I don't know whether you know about that or not.
No, please tell me.
But this is a program that runs out of the Library of Congress. The idea is to interview veterans about their experiences, not necessarily in the war, but after the war, in the war, before the war, and to record those on tape. And they are sent into the Library of Congress, and they put them on the web as audio files so people can listen. So it's a great idea because, the great-grandkids can listen to what their great-granddad did in the war.
Right. Oh,
so
that's great. Yes.
And I've interviewed, I guess, maybe 18 different veterans, about experiences in World War II, Korea to a certain extent, and Vietnam. I haven't interviewed anybody yet about the more recent wars, like in Afghanistan and so forth. But, obviously, in that situation, you learn about a lot of experiences that people have. And often they are not even able to talk about these things with their family.
Right.
Because they figure, on the one hand, well, they don't care to hear all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, it's often so painful.
Right.
But they don't really want to talk about it. So sometimes, the kids and the grandkids hear about it on the veteran's deathbed, or almost.
Right.
When they want to open up and share things that have affected them in their lives.
But you find that they will talk in an interview with you.
Yes, they do, and you may have to, prompt a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
You tell them up front. I mean, you do a whole introduction.
Mm-hmm.
That they don't have to talk about anything they don't want to talk about. And if, I ask a question that they don't want to address, that's perfectly fine. We'll move on to something else. And I'd like to give a brief example of that. I interviewed a World War II veteran at the Jemez Pueblo about his experiences. He was in the General Patton's Tank Corps during World War II and was one of the first people to come upon the Dachau concentration camp when the SS were still there packing up their bags, trying to clear out. So in the interview, his granddaughter happened to be sitting in. Usually I just do it alone, but she was sitting there. And when he mentioned Dachau, and then he went on and said, well, we went from there to Hitler's Eagle's Nest and blah, 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 in Bavaria. Wow. And the granddaughter said, Granddad, don't you want to talk a little more about Dachau? And he grimaced and said, "Well, I can." And so he said, his lieutenant told him, he was also the gunner on the tank, to blow open the door at Dachau. So he did that with his .50 caliber machine gun. And he described seeing piles of people.
Oh, my gosh.
Naked bodies. People still alive in those piles.
Oh, my gosh.
So emaciated. Kids crying, walking around, that it was just, it really got to him, as it would get to any human being.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was very, very difficult for him to talk about it. And I certainly didn't push him.
Right.
But I appreciated that he did share a few words about what he'd seen. And it was still, after 70 years, it was still affecting him.
I'm sure it was. Well, it's important to know those things, I think, even though it's so difficult for people to share them.
Yes, I think today, particularly with a lot of people, of course, don't have a very good grasp of history.
Right.
And younger people today know very little, really, about World War II, unless they happen to be buffs, and certainly Vietnam. And a lot of people, I think, don't realize how evil the Nazis were.
I don't think so.
How inhuman, and what that grew out of, fundamentally racism.
Right.
Which we're still burdened with today.
We are.
And I don't think a lot of people know what they're fooling around with.
I think you're right. And so this
very
is
dangerous.
Quite a service that you help with. Very good.
Well, yeah, I hope.
I'm sure.
But, to bring these things to life and to let people really know what it was all about. I remember watching one of the best war movies, I think, was Saving Private Ryan.
Oh, yeah.
By Spielberg.
Mm-hmm.
And he, of course, had a panel of World War II veterans who were advisors, and he was particularly concerned about the opening scenes, or the near-opening scenes, where it shows the Normandy invasion. And so he screened the clips from that to this audience of veterans, very nervously wondering how they're going to react. And he said one of the greatest compliments he ever had was a veteran came up to him with tears in his eyes and said, "You got it right." And, I even heard younger soldiers who've been in Afghanistan and other situations, mostly non-veterans, though, watch the movie and say, "I didn't realize how bad it was."
Mm-hmm.
And yet Spielberg could not show the worst parts because nobody would stay in the theater. So he showed some glimpses. There's a scene of an eviscerated veteran,
mm-hmm.
or eviscerated soldier there in the opening scene in Normandy. But it's just shown very briefly to give you an idea of what was happening. The real photographs from Normandy are even worse.
I'm
you
sure.
see bodies bobbing in the surf, and the surf is red. So, that's not a pleasant topic, but it certainly happens in our world, and unfortunately it looks like war is going to be a permanent presence in our lives.
I think so.
Not that all wars are bad. Some are certainly justified. No one would say that you should have given up to Hitler.
Exactly.
You would have had peace, but it wouldn't have been the kind of peace you wanted.
Exactly. It's an evil necessity, I think.
Necessary, yes, it is.
Yes.
And, we have to kind of look at it in two different perspectives. One is the horror of war,
mm-hmm.
and what it does to people, and particularly to civilians and countries and so forth. And then the other side is the tremendous courage and sacrifice that people are willing to undertake, really, for the country and for other people.
Well,
so it's a two-edged sword.
It is a two-edged sword. And we are just about out of time.
Sure. Okay.
So
well, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
And with you. And I enjoyed the book so much, and I look forward to reading more from you.
Okay, that would be great. Well, thanks again.
And thank you. All right.
And we will probably make contact in the future.
I hope so. Thank you, Alan. This is Tracy, right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico. You can contact me at righton@sanjuancollege.edu.